Gunpoint is a game that kind of just popped up for me. I wasn't really aware of it until I began looking for something to review and realized I couldn't afford to drop $60 on Remember Me, so I wasn't exactly expecting too much going into it. I hadn't been following its development at all the way I have with something like Cube World, and it hasn't gotten that much exciting buzz the way something like Bastion may have. So maybe it's just because my expectations were kind of low, but I find Gunpoint to be a really interesting game to say the least. Gunpoint is a 2D stealth game where you play as a freelance spy doing freelance work for various people. As soon as you're in-game, you're thrust into a somewhat intriguing story where you get the privilege of deciding your own level of immersion. If you want to read through the witty dialogue before and after your missions and follow the story, you can, but if you lose track of the plot around mission 2, you can go ahead and just treat this as a fun little stealth game and not pay any attention to the story. The story itself is done about as well as it can be. When you have a 2D game like this, you can't exactly weave exposition into the actual gameplay without making a bunch of cutscenes, so most of the story is told through dialogue either before or after the mission, or on little notes you'll find throughout the levels. The story itself is an interesting one, while not necessarily being something that's extremely immersive and edgy. You can't really have a connection with characters in 2D games the way you can in other big AAA releases. Someone can write their character as well as they possibly can, but the fact that you're not right there experiencing everything with the character him or herself from an either first or third person perspective makes it really hard to develop any sort of emotion with the people you'll be interacting with without doing something like To the Moon, making an extremely linear story-based game, or having some aspect like an incredible narrator as you would in Bastion or Thomas Was Alone. All that being said, this is a nice little addition to the game that has some funny dialogue, but more importantly, it doesn't break immersion or take anything away from the game. The main character himself is actually pretty funny too. He kind of reminds me of Garrett from Thief if he were a bit clumsier. You have some choices you can make throughout the game's dialogue, but I'm not sure they actually have any effect on the game itself. Without spoiling anything, there's a moment where I had to give some police guy either real data that I stole from a computer or just some fake data instead, but after giving him the real data, it just ended up being corrupted anyway, so it didn't even matter in the end. The art is absolutely fantastic. I love pixel art like this, and while I'm certainly not an art critic, from my perspective, it seems to be done fairly well. It sets a nice mood while being easy on the eyes, and although it doesn't have any real pop to it the way a game like Castlevania might with all the complementary colors, or the way that Fez might with all the vibrant retro colors, that only really reinforces the mood the game sets, a very relaxing, chill tone that's further reinforced with a cool jazzy soundtrack. The gameplay itself is fairly good. There's some typical well-done mechanics like an upgrade system and cool gadgets you can use, but the really fun thing is just getting to be a spy. Jumping up and down buildings, climbing them like you're Spider-Man, and tricking guards, getting them to look the wrong way with a noise so you can scamper past them is all really fun. The levels are a bit linear, so you don't really get to solve problems your preferential way like how you can in other games. You can choose whether to beat up weaker guards or sneak past them, but most of the time the levels have fairly linear paths to your objective, and you're more of a puzzle solver than a sneaky spy. Don't get me wrong, it's still extremely gratifying and fun, but there is one big flaw. Well, actually 2 flaws. Maybe I'm the most unlucky person in the world, but I encountered some pretty frustrating bugs. One time I jumped through a door that was locked because I accidentally clicked jump instead of my rewire tool, and I ended up stuck in my objective room, jumping from side to side hoping I can glitch through the wall again. If you get stuck or die, you can load previous autosaves, but they only go back like 13 seconds max, so I had to end up restarting the entirety of the level. But that's a minor flaw that probably only affects super unlucky people like myself. The big issue I have with this game, well, it isn't really a flaw, just a bit of a comment. 2D stealth is a really difficult thing to nail. The way to do stealth right is to have easily distinguishable stealthed and unstealthed areas where you know whether you're visible or not, preferably through a visibility indicator like your watch in the Metro games or your light bar in Thief, with bonus points if enemies have a bit of hesitation when reacting to your presence. If someone sees you in broad daylight, okay, fine, you're detected, but if you accidentally step out into a slightly lighter, more visible area, it's only fair to give the player a warning noise followed with a, "Hey, I think I saw something." The reason I bring this up is these qualities are pretty famous requirements for good stealth games, and this one has neither. A simple glimpse of you falling past a window will cause guards to rush to the edge of it and shoot you immediately with 100% accuracy if they can still see you, and you can never really tell if you're visible or not. It is pretty obvious in most cases. If a guard is facing your direction and you're in a lighted area, he's gonna see you. But a decent portion of the game involves sneaking around rooms the guards are still in, either with the lights off or while their backs are turned. When the lights are off, guards have a harder time seeing through the dark, but without a visibility indicator or anything, you don't really know how far their vision is or whether you're visible from whatever distance or not. I'm not saying there should be a visibility indicator. It doesn't really work in this environment, and 2D games probably shouldn't even worry about them, but it is something worth mentioning. Stealth is done right with clear indications of visibility and slight hesitations with enemy AI. This game having neither is interesting, especially since it's a pretty good stealth game with only minor issues. Come to think of it though, this is actually more of a puzzle game than a stealth one. You focus much more on making your way around the level without running into guards rather than actually sneaking past them the way you would in something like Thief. I'm probably looking way too much into this. It doesn't really have any effect on the game at all, and it's kind of obvious that you don't incorporate 3D game elements into 2D games like this, but it's something I think might be worth mentioning. I don't really know if this game is for everyone. It doesn't really have any popping wow factor that makes it stick out in the back of your mind as a top stealth or puzzle game. Its gameplay is really good, and it's a pretty fun experience, but you may lose interest after a couple hours of play, especially if you're the kind of person who doesn't necessarily like stealth games. Not to mention, it is a bit short. Some people say they can beat it in 2 hours or less. But in terms of an intriguing little surprise with good stealthy puzzle elements, Gunpoint is definitely worth a look. You'll have to decide for yourself, though, whether it's worth $10.